Hey, welcome back to The Rent Roll, your podcast on all things rental housing. I'm your host, Jay Parsons. And today we're going to do something a little bit different. We've been talking to a lot of industry people and we'll continue to do that. But today we're going to talk to the mayor of Bellevue, Washington, the home of the second biggest economic engine in the state of Washington behind only Seattle. Bellevue, of course, on the east side, really anchors the east side of the Seattle metro area. That's a city that's done a really good job building housing. So we're going to have I have the great privilege of talking to Dr. Lynee Robinson, the mayor, about how cities and developers can work effectively together. Before we do that, I want to thank our sponsor, Madera Residential. Check them out at maderaresidential.com. And let's dive into some data. As always, that's what we're here for. Let's look at some data and ground our discussion in the data. And in the theme of cities and developers working together, I want to start with this headline from the census that really frames up how policymakers often think about renting today. It says nearly half of renter households are cost burdened. And this just came out September 12th, so just last month. And it's kind of, again, this frames up how we oftentimes think about renters, which is the cost burdens that we see. But what's interesting is we break this down, whether it's the census data or the private sector data, we really see the bifurcation of affordability. I talked about this in a prior episode, but I want to go into this a little bit different angle today. This next chart, if you can see it, and if not, I'll walk you through it. What it says is that apartment and SFR REITs show rent income ratios around 20%. And then I compare that to the census, where the typical ratio is 31% of income that's spent on rent. Now, look at these apartment and SFR REITs. They're ranging from, about 17 to 23% of income spent on rent. And so what does that tell us? Well, it tells us, again, that affordability is bifurcated. You have a case of the haves and the have-nots. And what we see is that in these professionally managed investment grade REIT communities or institutionally owned privately held apartments, the affordability story is just very, very different. These are renters who are generally middle and upper income, spending a lower share of income based on rent. And this next data point is from the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University, and it shows cost burden by household income level. And what it's really shown you here is that the higher the income, the lower the likelihood that the renters are cost burdened. Obviously, no surprise. But when you look at who's living in the professionally managed market rate apartment market, like those served by the REITs, you look at that, it's really those that are making north of $50,000, in many cases $75,000 to $100,000. And you can see the share of renters at those income levels that are cost burdened is significantly lower than those that are making less than, in this case, $45,000, and especially those who are under $30,000. That's when we see under 30K, more than 75% of renters are cost burdened. But again, these aren't households who are living in professionally managed market rate apartments. And they didn't generally live in market rate professionally managed apartments even prior to the pandemic and the inflationary run up in rents. Now, this last thing here will show you very low income households impacted by the shortage of rental assistance. And so what's happened is over the last 20 years, as Harvard data is showing you, is the change in the number of households, lower income households, that are being served by rental assistance programs of various types. And what you'll notice here is that the number that have been assisted really hasn't changed that much in 20 years. But the share that's been unassisted and have severe to moderate problems has grown dramatically from just north of 10 million to now about 14 million households that are unassisted and have severe or moderate to severe problems. And so this is really the crux of the challenges today, is a lack of affordable housing for those who really need it. Ample demand at the top part of the market. We've seen great growth in those higher income renters. In fact, they're the biggest driver of new renter household formation, those making $70,000 and up. But there's, again, bifurcated story here. We have challenges at the low end of the market. And then, so as you think about how cities and developers can work together, there's really two things. Number one is obviously affordable housing. But number two is even your traditional market rate housing. So the last thing I want to share in this segment here is this research study by the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. The headline is How New Apartments Create Opportunities for All. Market rate rental construction in Minneapolis has freed up more affordable homes for households across the income spectrum. And I've talked about this quite a bit in the past, but I want to again bring this into this conversation to show that in this case, there's been ample research showing that we build even at the top end of the market, there's a filtering effect, not trickle down. Don't let anybody fool you to think there's trickle down. Go ahead and Google what trickle down economics is. It has nothing to do with housing filtering. They're entirely different concepts. That's just a loaded term people use to try to convince you that filtering isn't already a proven science. It actually is. Filtering is the idea we build at the top of the market, which is generally it pencils out. You pull your higher income renters out of the pre-existing older communities, and they move up to the new supply. That opens up availability at the more moderate and lower price points. And in reality, it's a multiple tier effect, right? Your A minus renter moving to the new community, your B renter to the A minus, your C to the B, and then your C is having to cut rents enough to pull in people who previously did not qualify for market rate rentals. And that's why we tend to see bigger rent cuts in the Class C area where there is a lot of supply. So again, if you think about cities and developers working together, I think it's really important to be mindful, whether you're a developer or whether you're a policymaker, of this bifurcated story of affordability, which is when we always could use more market rate professionally managed apartments. That serves a great purpose. The more we build, the better. At the same time, there is a severe shortage of affordable housing and rental assistance for those who cannot qualify for today's market rate. So it's a both and, not an either or. All right. So hope that's a little bit helpful. And we'll talk more about cities and developers working together as we get into the interview portion with Dr. Lynee Robinson later in today's program. But first, let's get into some trivia. Rental housing trivia. All right, starting about affordable housing. And so the question today is, the U.S. federal government created the low-income housing tax credit under which former president? And I'm sharing this today because LIHTC's birthday is coming up, October 22nd. I'm not going to tell you what year, because that would give away the answer to today's trivia question. But October 22nd, the LIHTC program will turn another year older. So think about who that might be. I'll give you one hint. It's not George Washington. And we'll come back to that later in the program. And now let's turn to the headline. In the news, so I got three headlines to look at today. The first one comes from NPR and its great radio program, All Things Considered. This is the written version. It says, "One possible housing crisis solution, ? A new kind of public housing for all income levels." So this article really gets into, I think the love affair for some type of public housing. We're seeing renewed interest in public housing. And oftentimes, including cases like this, we really don't take the time to look back at why the United States walked away from public housing models several decades ago, which led, of course, to the creation of the LIHTC program. So number one, I think it's important to recognize that it's one thing to build it, it's another thing to maintain it. And when you see in articles like this, there's this undertone that sort of implies that, hey, if investors just weren't taking all this profit, then we keep rents to be much more affordable. It's just not that simple. I don't have time to break all that down today. There's been a lot of good, research out there showing what percentage of rent actually goes to investors. It's much lower than people tend to think. And also, too, it also kind of forgets the fact that a lot of investors, they really make their money based on the buying and selling of real estate, and also the refinancing, cashing out. It's less so just on the dividend yield associated with the rent. So I don't think they're going to get rents as low as they probably think without kind of other types of subsidies they want to put in here relative to what they also do with programs like the low-income housing tax credit. But the other challenge I think to point out here is the article actually NPR spoke also to Jenny Schutz at the Brookings Institute, and she pointed out this. She said Montgomery County was happening. Montgomery County is just outside of Washington, D.C. She said Montgomery County is big, it's wealthy, they have phenomenally competent and experienced staff. These are really unusual characteristics for most local governments across the U.S. And Jenny wrote a great book called Fixer Upper that kind of gets into how to solve affordability challenges for housing. And so she would know. And unfortunately, NPR kind of buried her comment deep into the article and had another comment sort of taking the opposite view from hers. But it is an important point, which is that this isn't really a scalable model for most of the country. And I doubt we'll even see it meaningfully scaled, even in a wealthy county like Montgomery County. And so I think it's really important to, hey, I'm all the above guy. Let's try it. All things are better than no things. But is it really a solution to the housing crisis? Maybe one small component, but it's going to take a lot more than this. Next, I want to take a headline from the Minnesota Reformer. This one says, Minneapolis cuts red tape for developers turning office buildings into housing. And I'll read a little bit from here. It says, under the new rules, commercial to residential conversion projects will not be subject to public hearings. Instead, the plans will only require approval by city staff. The ordinance will also exempt projects from intensive traffic studies and from an inclusionary zoning ordinance that requires developers to designate a portion of apartments as affordable housing or pay large fees instead. And then I love this quote from the mayor of Minneapolis. He said, "Time is money and uncertainty is money. If we cut down on the uncertainty and cut down the time it takes to get it done, more owners and developers will choose to make that shift." And, I love it when we see elected officials who get it. There's been so much talk about how time is money, uncertainty is money. When it takes years to get projects approved, that costs money. Where do you think that money ultimately, and who ends up paying those costs? It's obviously renters or home buyers, whatever the project might be. In this case, probably renters. And so it's really, really important to recognize that the longer we take, the more cost that is, which means the higher the rent will be. And so this is a great step. In general, I think I've talked about this previously as well, is that, I don't think we're going to see a massive wave of office to residential conversions, but everything helps. One more project is a good thing. So if this helps have some of that in Minneapolis, where downtown office has been very challenged, that would be a great thing. And I just love the precedent we set here of removing red tape and understanding the relationship between time and costs and rent. Next headline comes from the Wall Street Journal. This is a really in-depth piece. It says, "They wanted their first home. It took sacrifices, risk, and a little creativity. Americans reveal how they overcome the challenges of the housing market." All right. So everybody knows that it's difficult to buy a house these days. Mortgages are pricey. Home prices haven't come down that much. And the rent to the rent or buy gap, at least for a first-time home buyer, is as significant as it's been in a very, very long time. So let me read from this article, because I think it does a great job sort of dispelling some of the myths we hear about first-time home buyers. It says, "Across the U.S., first-time home buyers are still making it work. While homeowners have pulled back from the market because they don't want to give up their low mortgage rate, meaning repeat buyers, first-time buyers are still pushing ahead. Often these buyers are making sacrifices, such as choosing smaller homes, moving farther from the city centers, or getting creative with financing for their home purchase." But check out the stat here. 55% of government-backed and conventional purchase mortgages in August went to first-time homebuyers, the highest level for any August in data going back to 2014. And the article says demographics are a reason. Millions of millennials in their early to mid 30s, probably late 30s too, are the typical age for first-time homebuyers. And they talked to the chief economist at Freddie Mac, who says that they've been first-time homebuyers. They're driving, and millennials, they're driving the market. I think it will at least continue through the end of this decade. Again, it's from the chief economist at Freddie Mac. So great article, and it really helps kind of dispel a couple of things here. Number one, as I hear a lot of people say that, there's no first-time homebuyers anymore. Everyone's having to rent instead, and that's why apartment demand and SFR demand is what it is. And that's, I don't think, true. And I've talked about some of that before. I'm not going to get into that more depth, but this is a good example of showing you that first-time homebuyers are still out there. In fact, they're the biggest part of the market. They're not locked in to a lower rate, obviously. At the end of the day, if you want to have a single-family house and you plan to be there a long time, no matter the math of renting or buying, go buy that house. I think that's what we're seeing people do, is that that's the life stage you're in. That's what works. That's what's happening. And the second thing this also shows is that, there's this false narrative that that single-family rental investors are blocking out first-time home buyers. Obviously, that's not happening. Again, they're the bulk of the buyers out there in the market. If anything, the problem is there's just not enough inventory, because we see current homeowners just aren't willing to sell because they don't have anywhere to go and they're already locked into a great rate. So great article from the Wall Street Journal. Highly recommend it. Next, we get into new digs. And in honor of our guest interview today, we are going to look at Bellevue, Washington, where she is the mayor. And we're going to highlight a project that's very cool, a workforce housing right in downtown Bellevue, outside of Seattle. It's the Terrapin Apartments, and especially love that name, being a graduate myself of the University of Maryland, the Terrapins. So the Terrapin Apartments, 172 units developed by Johnson & Carr. Local media article says that the mid-rise building is a transit-oriented development that is located within a quarter mile of 11 public transit stops and a half mile of the new downtown Bellevue Link light rail station. And it's funded in part by $20.15 million below market rate loan from Amazon's Housing Equity Fund. And so we're going to talk more with Bellevue's mayor about the impact of Amazon and also Microsoft investing in affordable housing in their backyards. So that's going to be a good conversation. But this particular one, the Terrapin Apartments, scheduled to complete in December of 2025. So really cool. And by the way, also looking at that picture, it reminds you, it's like, hey, today's affordable workforce housing, it doesn't look like what you probably think affordable housing might look like. These are nice projects. And it's really cool to see this one getting built. All right, next up, good question. This is when I take questions we get across social media. Good one the other day. This was about apartment supply, and I got asked, how will this surge in new completions affect property management strategies, especially with so much new inventory hitting the market in such a short time frame? And what measures can be taken to mitigate potential oversupply in areas where demand might not keep pace with the number of new units coming online? All right, great question. What can property managers do to compete with all this new supply? And this is specific to the apartment side, where we see apartment supply is at the highest levels in 50 years. So obviously, I think we're actually seeing some of this thing happen right now. There's been a big focus across the property management industry on back to the basics, heads in beds, high touch customer service, quick resolution of maintenance requests. Resident satisfaction is what it's all about. If people don't have to move because of a relocation or not moving to buy a house or whatever, then you want to do everything you can to control those, to control what you can control. And so what we're seeing, I think, across the industry is this big focus on just going, again, back to the basics. It's not 21, 22 anymore, where renters have a lot of options. They didn't have a lot of options, excuse me. Now they do. And so typically your controllable reasons for move out have to do with things like unresolved maintenance tickets, has to do with complaints with neighbors and noise and pets, things like that. And also the lack of response from your property management team. And so if you can deal with those things, you can help resolve conflict, you help get those tickets resolved quickly, those maintenance issues. You can be responsive. Again, just basic stuff, as well as just keeping up the community amenity spaces, things like that, making sure that things look nice. Like those are the things that are going to help drive retention. And beyond that too, programs like Apartment Life that help facilitate community and relationships on site. There's great research in Apartment Life showing that if people who have friendships within the community are more likely to stay put. So a lot of good things already happening. And if you're not doing those things, recommend it. All right, now let's move into the complaints department. This is where I take some of the more cynical comments that I get on social media, whether it's on X or on LinkedIn, and try to address that here. So today's one is I was talking about kind of the challenges for developers and kind of saying, hey, cities and developers have to work together to find solutions to housing and really making sure that we're welcoming in developers and not pushing them away in other cities who are going to go where they're wanted. And so someone on X commented, maybe it's good they go elsewhere, talking about developers. Maybe other areas are more appropriate for more housing. Maybe the impacts of more housing are far less in other places. Building other places can help a city's housing issues. And so basically saying, hey, look, like I'm okay if we keep people out of our city, put them somewhere else. And this is really, I think, a great, definition of NIMBYism. They're saying, hey, yeah, we need more housing, just not in my backyard. And that's what NIMBYism really is. So this is the type of stuff we're up against where everybody likes more housing, they just don't want it where they are. And so this is the type of mindset that we really need to change, understand that, hey, we want to create an environment where people can live in these communities. And so housing is important, and people want to live where they want to live. They don't want to go live out 200 miles out from the city. They want to live in the city, or they want to live in a prime suburb. They want to live close to their job. It's not always about being downtown, but it's about being in good, communities that have access to, whether it's schools or jobs or transportation or retail. Like all of those things matter. And so getting housing matters. Back to our trivia question. The question today was, the U.S. federal government had created the low-income housing tax credit under which former president? All right, so give it some thought. The answer is President Ronald Reagan. So happy birthday to LIHTC. The low-income housing tax credit will be turning 38 years old on October 22nd. This was bipartisan legislation passed in 1986. 176 Democrats, 116 Republicans in the House voted for passage. 33 Democrats and 41 Republicans voted for this bill in the Senate. It's a win-win because it solved the problems associated with traditional public housing by creating a more sustainable affordable housing model through public-private partnerships. It was a carrot not a stick, it was a carrot and a stick together that essentially creates a version of funded rent control. So it's rents based on income. And it's a win-win that today is one of the policies that really unites both housing advocates, tenant advocates, as well as industry groups, developers, and the IMBY crowd. It's a win-win for communities, for residents, and for developers. So today we have nearly 3 million renter households living in LIHTC properties. Now, is it perfect? No, of course not. But it's impactful in providing affordable housing for millions of families. So my vote is yes, let's improve it and expand it. And with that, we're going to move into the interview. And I'll be welcoming in Dr. Lynee Robinson, the mayor of Bellevue, Washington. All right, and welcome back. Now we're going to get into the interview portion of today's podcast. I've recentered my map behind me to show the great state of Washington and Bellevue, one of the great suburbs of Seattle behind me, because I'm joined by a very special guest, the mayor of Bellevue, Dr. Lynee Robinson. So Dr. Robinson, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I love the work that you're doing.
Oh, I appreciate that. So Mayor Robinson and I have gotten to know each other a little bit via LinkedIn and just talking about housing issues across the country. And the reason I'm particularly excited to have you on as a guest is because Bellevue's been on my radar for a long time as somebody who kind of watches cities across the country. And the way I see it is that compared to a lot of other West Coast cities, Bellevue is an example of a city that's done a really good job adding housing in recent years, especially higher density multifamily housing. And so from an outside perspective, it seems like Bellevue's been more aggressive in attracting developers and businesses, fewer barriers to entry, more collaboration. And plus, of course, you have a very vibrant, attractive, well-located city. So that's my perspective as a guy who lived in Texas. But is that a fair assessment? Or what, in your view, has been Bellevue's secret to success?
Well, first off, I'll say we have probably more land than a lot of cities our size. And we pride ourselves not in being a suburb of Seattle, in being an independent city, because we are the second largest economy in the state of Washington. But I would say that I think the secret sauce to Bellevue is I'm from the health profession, and we talk about community health. And community health is basically a community that doesn't add to you making you sick. So the things that rank you high in community health are like a high quality of life, access to health care, a clean environment, clean water, clean air. Having those things gives you a higher natural health level, right? So quality of life, I think about that. I think about access to parks and open spaces, access to a good public education, high public safety. All those things contribute to a higher quality of life. And that's what Bellevue focuses on. And so there's no bad neighborhood in Bellevue. There's no bad school in Bellevue. There's no bad park. And almost everybody is walking distance to some kind of a green space or a trail or a park. And those are things that attract people. That's what attracts employees and retains employees. And so when our employees that live here change jobs, they don't necessarily move. They tend to stay here and either find another job in the region or they start their own company. And that creates your mature workforce, which then attracts your employers. So it's kind of a combination of things that I think has hit a sweet spot in Bellevue. And it's something that as a council, we really focus on.
Yeah, I love to hear that, and certainly Bellevue is unique. And you're right, like Bellevue don't say. I'll tell you, last time I was in that area, I was doing an event. I think it was in Kirkland, and I'm staying in Bellevue. I wasn't going to Seattle. I'm staying in Bellevue, downtown Bellevue. It's a great spot for those who watching not been there. So I'm sure that you've worked with a lot of different developers over the years, apartment developers. So I'd love to get your perspective on what do the best ones do to stand out? What are the characteristics and behaviors of developers who can be most successfully work with cities in ways that are mutually beneficial and ultimately successful in building housing?
Well, I love that question. And I think that Bellevue's unique. We have a lot of developers who live here. And so I call them developers with a conscience because they have to live with whatever they build. So that makes for great developers. I think that, you know, a developer that can work with the city and understand what the amenities are and not just put a perfunctory amenity and say they did, but actually they do something that contributes to the community. Knowing that we need affordable housing, if they'll take us up on some of the incentives that we offer, we appreciate that. Good architecture, of course, I always appreciate. So, being a partner with the city, and it's a two-way street, right? We've got to make it easy for developers to do what they want to do. And so we've been very fortunate to have great development in Bellevue.
Yeah, no, you really do. It's a beautiful place. And speaking of that, a lot of people, at least in the apartment business, know Bellevue for its beautiful Class A apartment towers. But I know from our conversations that affordable and attainable housing is very important to you. And Bellevue has what sounds like a very productive partnership with Amazon's Housing Equity Fund. So, can you talk a little about that partnership and the impact it's had on housing?
Yeah, well, it's not just Amazon. We have that same partnership with Microsoft as well.
Oh, good.
They also have an equity fund. And so it's primarily a very low interest loan. And but they have done some grants. Both companies have done some grants as well. And primarily we've used it to retain housing. I don't know how much you've spent thinking about that, but that is one of
Right.
the best things you can do in your community is when an older apartment or condominium building goes on the market, instead of selling it and having it convert to high-end housing, which is generally what happens, and usually they get torn down, right? And you lose a whole community of people who are living there who get priced out. These funds have allowed us to partner with the King County Housing Authority and another organization called Lehigh, which is low income housing. What's high? I forget what the I is, but Institute, I think. But anyway, that's allowed us to go in and buy the building, make it permanently affordable, fix it up, bring it up to look like new, and retain entire communities of people. So we're not losing people as, prices are going up, obviously, but we're able to retain our communities. And then we are also building new workforce housing with those funds.
Yeah.
So Amazon and Microsoft have partnered with affordable housing developers to do that as well. So, 10 years ago, only 10% of all housing in Bellevue was affordable to anybody earning less than 80% AMI.
Yeah.
That's, you know, that's a high level
Yeah.
that you have to pay to live here. So our teachers couldn't live here, our firefighters, our police, our service workers. And so you think about all these people commuting in every day and then commuting out, and they're part of your community for the workday, but not for the rest of the time that they're here. And so it really behooves everybody to have that opportunity to live close to where you work, to have that 12-minute city lifestyle. And so we've been working really hard to put denser housing around our transit oriented, I say, communities, and really incentivize that type of housing. And Amazon and Microsoft have been great partners in doing that.
I love to hear that. And I love that point too about the preservation, because this is such a difficult topic, because you hit on it really well, because these are older buildings that need a lot of work. And so sometimes, like, there's this predicament of from the private sector, it's like, if you buy it, you're going to have to put in the capital that's going to require raising rents, unless there's some sort of public-private partnership that allows
Yep.
for those costs to be subsidized. So when you could do that, that's a win-win.
Well, the older buildings tend to be 2 and 3 bedrooms.
Yeah.
And we prioritize buildings near schools. So we're trying to house families.
That's great. I love it. Yeah, because as for those watching, obviously we don't build a lot of 2s and 3s, or 3s, especially these days. A lot of 1s and 2s, and mostly 1s in studios. So let's talk a little about development. And as you know, every city leader has to listen to their constituents. But sometimes, one of the things I hear from developers all the time is they go to these city council meetings, P&Z meetings, and you have people who say things that just aren't true. Look up, say, hey, this development's going to, especially affordable housing, they'll say this development's going to come up, it's going to increase crime, that'll increase traffic, it's going to overcrowd our schools. And sadly, I think a lot of people believe these things about renters and about apartments. And so when these types of things come up, what can housing developers do to work with city leaders and city staff to provide the facts to dispel some of these myths and fears?
Well, I think it really helps to kind of describe who we're trying to house here. I mean, how many children who graduate from Bellevue School District, go to college, and come back can afford to live in our city?
Yeah.
None. Very, very few, unless they get some help. And so, you think about that's a harsh reality that as soon as your kids leave the nest, they can't come back. And so when you think about that way, that makes it much more palatable. And we really need to, and you look at the homeless crisis. Every city has a homeless crisis of one degree or another, and Bellevue has theirs. And we're not importing homeless people from around the country. These are our own. And there's no sliding scale on rents in Bellevue. There hasn't been. That's something we're working on. And so if you lose your job and you get a half, let's say you can only afford half of what you were paying in rent before, there's no option. And so creating the micro housing units, creating detached dwelling units, attached dwelling units, duplexes, triplexes, multifamily, townhouses, single family homes, the whole spectrum of housing with all the spectrum of affordability. That makes for a healthy community and a stable community as well.
Yeah. No, I love that. It's great. That's important to point out. Um, and hopefully other cities take a note, because that's important for every city in the country, not just Bellevue. So, um, housing policy, I have this, I love to see, kind of good and bad right now. Like, I like seeing housing policy more discussed in the national picture, but there's also some other things that come with it. So it's front and center right now, the campaign trail, even the presidential campaign. But at the end of the day, as you know, I mean, housing is local. Cities control zoning, permitting, entitlement. Cities control regulations of what get built and where. And I think this gets lost in the national dialogue somewhere. So I'd love to flip this around and ask, from your perspective as a mayor, what can the federal government do? What can the White House do that could actually be effective in helping cities build and approve more housing?
I love this question because you one thing that the state of Washington did is they took away local control of zoning in our neighborhoods. So for years we've been saying, oh, sure, we're going to put multifamily over here, here, and here, but don't touch our neighborhoods. And they went ahead and passed a law that says you have to allow for increased density in your neighborhood. So all that housing that I just described, all that variety can happen now in our neighborhoods to some degree. The challenge with that is we don't really have the infrastructure to support if an entire neighborhood transitioned to significant increased density. So there's a balance in what we can handle and what we need to allow legally and, realistically. Um, but to your point, it's really important for the city to make it easier for developers to develop. And that's where the good relationships come in. So, you want to put this building in here, you want to create this many units. Here's what we need. We need you to maybe focus on this level of AMI for part of it. For 20% of it, can you do 80% AMI? And if you do that, I'm going to give you increased FAR. I'm going to give you increased height, and I'm going to lower your parking requirements. Things like that. We have to work together because time is money, and that cost gets passed on to the consumer. And so if we really want to keep creating housing that's affordable to the people who work in our city and want to live here, we have to make it easy for developers to do that so that they don't have to balloon their costs because they're waiting so long for a permit. They have to put in all this parking that's not going to get used and whatever else they complain about.
I love that because all across the country we see cities that just don't get it. There's some suburbs near us that have, and where I live in the Dallas area, that have just effectively banned garden style apartments, which are the cheapest apartments to build. So they want to have structured parking, which is then more expensive, and all that. We've seen some cities in California that are weaponizing environmental laws to make projects take 10 years to sometimes get done. So that just makes things more expensive. So I love the way that you talk about that and the importance. Time is money, like you said.
Well, you
Um,
highlighted so well in your research the the supply and demand. I mean, we're seeing that we're putting so much more housing in
mhm.
Bellevue that the rents are going down as they always said they would.
Yeah.
And so, we're 10 years, our country is 10 years behind
Yeah.
in housing development. And there's so many people moving to the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
So trying to keep up with that influx and trying to compensate for the lack of development historically is really, really a challenge. And you had asked me in the last question, what can the federal government do? They need to invest in housing like they've invested in transportation. This
Mm.
is a make it or break it time in our country. And we just have got to create more housing. We've got to invest in that, whether it's a voucher program, and it's not just go build a bunch of houses. It's not that. We need to build communities. We need to put housing with schools and community centers. And there's a really great development that's a good example of this called Greenbridge. And I think it's in South Center in Washington State. And that is an affordable housing community that they built an entire community with home ownership, affordable home ownership, as well as rentals, with a community center around a school, with all this space for small businesses. It is thriving. It is just thriving, and it's a great spot for people to start off and move on or to live out their life. It's been so successful, and I think it's a good example. And that was a lot of federal money.
Yeah, I love it. I love to hear the story, success stories like that. And I like that too, building communities. You want, like you said, communities, not just houses. Sometimes the cynics on social media, it's like, hey, we just build a way out in the middle of nowhere, and that'll be
Yeah.
cheaper that way. Well, that doesn't really. People don't want to live there. It doesn't help anybody. Well, a last question for you, Dr. Robinson. As we think toward the future, I'd love to get your advice. What can apartment builders do to be better partners for cities in advancing their housing development goals?
Well, it's been somewhat easier for us because, as I say, so many of our developers live in their city that they're developing in, so they well know what the challenges are. But I think partnering with the city, it's a two-way street. City's got to partner with them. I think understanding what amenities are important to that area. If the city is in trying to create a community project and your property is adjacent to it, can you contribute to it? Can you put
Yeah.
your green space that backs up next to the park so we can extend the park? Can you put in bike infrastructure while you're developing? I mean, what is it that the city needs that you can give back while you develop? And I think you'll find that there are a lot of developers who feel the city's asked too much of them. And I think sometimes that is true. And so there's got to be that balance where we get the beautiful architecture and we get actual development of housing that we need, but we are also giving back to the city. And so a really good example is in Bellevue. Nobody wants to do condominiums in Washington State because the condominium laws hold
Yeah.
the builders too highly accountable,
Right.
and so they've been trying to work on that. So we have all these provisions that, like, you want to come in and do a condo and you give us 20% at 80% AMI, we'll let you go higher. You can have more density, and we have all these incentives. And not a single local developer would take advantage of that. Nobody wanted to do condos. They do townhouses, they do multifamily. But there was a developer from Canada who comes in, and they do tons of affordable housing in Canada. And they come in and they just go, we're doing a condo. What do you need? It's like, really? They took advantage of every single incentive that we offered. And so now when the local developers say I can't do that, I go, well, how come Bosa did? How come they could do it?
That's
So
great.
Bosa was a very good partner.
I love to hear that. Yeah, that's been a real challenge across the country. There's very few condos being built outside of a few cities like Miami for that reason, and among others. But well, well, Dr. Robinson, I really appreciate you joining and making the time to talk with us, and hopefully talk to developers and cities across the country who are having similar challenges, looking at partnerships. So, but I appreciate the time, and thank you for being part of the solution.
Ah, thank you, Jay. Keep up the good work. Always enjoy reading what you post.
Thank you so much. And with that, it's going to wrap us up for episode 5. Big thanks to 3 groups. Number 1, thank you to Dr. Lynee Robinson of Bellevue, Washington, for joining for today's Q&A. I really enjoyed that. Hope you did as well. Number 2, thanks to our sponsor, Madera Residential. Again, check them out at maderaresidential.com. And number 3, thank you to all of you for spending part of your day with me. I hope this podcast has been helpful and useful and educational. I'd love to get your feedback, so send it my way, good or bad. I want to hear it. Enjoy the rest of your day.